The Central Highlands of Vietnam, July 1967. The air was a physical presence, a thick, wet blanket of 95-degree heat and 100% humidity that made every breath feel like a conscious effort. For the men of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile, the jungle was a relentless, suffocating adversary. It was a world of green upon green, a triple canopy ceiling that blocked out the sun, leaving them in a perpetual, eerie twilight. The thick, tangled undergrowth of wait-a-minute vines and razor-sharp elephant grass clawed at their uniforms, while leeches and fire ants found their way into boots and shirts with relentless determination. Private First Class Marcus Mack Kowalski, a 19-year-old machine gunner from the steel mill city of Gary, Indiana, wiped a grimy sleeve across his forehead, succeeding only in smearing more dirt and sweat into his eyes. His M60 machine gun, which he had christened the Pig, weighed 23 pounds unloaded, but with a 100-round belt of 7.62 millimeter ammunition, it felt closer to 30. The heat of the barrel, even without recent firing, bled through his uniform, a constant, uncomfortable warmth against his leg. He was a big kid, built for the hard labor of the mills, and the Army, in its infinite wisdom, had seen his size and made him a gunner. He was the backbone of the fire team, the one who laid down the suppressing fire that allowed everyone else to move. It was a job that came with a massive target painted on your back. They were 3 days into a reconnaissance-in-force patrol along a suspected Viet Cong and NVA infiltration route near the Cambodian border. The mission was simple on paper: find the enemy and engage. In reality, it was a nerve-shredding game of cat and mouse in a jungle where the mouse was invisible and knew the terrain intimately. The point man, a lanky kid from Texas named Rodriguez, was 10 meters ahead, his eyes constantly scanning, his M16 held at the ready. The rest of the platoon moved in a staggered column behind him, a silent, weary snake of green fatigues and steel helmets. Then the jungle went quiet. It wasn't a gradual thing. One moment, the air was filled with the deafening, oscillating whine of cicadas, the chattering of monkeys, and the distant calls of exotic birds. The next, there was nothing, an absolute, profound silence that was more terrifying than any sound. It was the oldest warning in the book, a primal signal that every predator in the area had either fled or was lying in wait. The platoon froze as one, a single organism holding its breath. Rodriguez held up a clenched fist, his body rigid. The first shot was a single, sharp crack that came from their front. It was followed a fraction of a second later by the distinctive, heavier thud of the round impacting flesh. Rodriguez crumpled without a sound. Then, the world exploded. It wasn't a haphazard volley of fire. It was a disciplined, murderously efficient L-shaped ambush, a classic and devastating NVA tactic. A storm of AK-47 fire erupted from their front, the rounds snapping through the air, shredding leaves and tearing into the lead squad. Men dove for cover, their training taking over. But the cover was pathetic, thin teak trees, shallow depressions, termite mounds that offered the illusion of safety before anyone could even return fire. The second, deadlier part of the L was revealed. From their left flank, no more than 50 meters away, a heavy machine gun opened up. It was an RPD. Its faster, higher-pitched cyclic rate, a terrifying counterpoint to the AKs. It fired in controlled 5 to 7 round bursts, raking the American column with enfilading fire. This was the killing blow. The fire from the front pinned them, while the machine gun on the flank systematically cut them to pieces. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, damp earth, and the coppery tang of blood. The desperate shouts began, "I'm hit! Corpsman! Corpsman up!" Sergeant Johansson, a hardened veteran of Korea, was shouting orders, trying to organize a base of fire, when a round caught him in the thigh, spinning him to the ground. The lieutenant, a young officer fresh from West Point named Evans, was trying to be everywhere at once, his voice cracking as he yelled, "Return fire! Lay down, suppressing fire!" But his orders were lost in the maelstrom. The platoon's own M60, operated by Kowalski's assistant gunner, Private Jenkins, had been a primary target. The enemy's first RPD burst had chewed up the ground around their position, and a piece of shrapnel or ricochet had smashed into the feed tray cover, jamming the weapon. They were blind on one side, pinned down, and being methodically dismantled. The NVA had them in a perfect kill zone, and they were preparing the final maneuver to finish the job. From his position behind a termite mound that seemed to shrink with every passing second, PFC Marcus Kowalski processed the chaos with a strange, cold clarity. The training, the drills, the endless lectures, it all flashed through his mind, but it was drowned out by the raw data his senses were feeding him. He saw the RPD's muzzle flash from the flank, a stuttering orange eye in the green gloom. He heard the specific, disciplined rhythm of its fire. He saw the main body of AK fire concentrating on the pinned-down point and second squads. This wasn't random. This was a machine, a well-oiled killing machine, and he understood its next move. They would keep the platoon suppressed with this interlocking fire, while a smaller element, probably 3 or 4 NVA soldiers, would maneuver around to the right flank, close the trap, and finish them at close range with grenades and point-blank fire. They had minutes, maybe less. Standard doctrine screamed one thing: a machine gunner's job in an ambush is to establish a base of fire, find a stable position, try to suppress the enemy's main weapon. But their M60 was down. Jenkins was frantically trying to clear the jam, his fingers slippery with sweat and blood from a superficial cut on his cheek. "It's fucked. Mack, the feed tray is bent. We're fucked." Jenkins' voice was a panicked screech, barely audible over the gunfire. Kowalski's eyes weren't on Jenkins. They were fixed on the terrain between his position and that deadly RPD. The NVA had chosen their ground well, but no position was perfect. He saw a slight depression in the earth, a runoff gully choked with thick, head-high elephant grass. It ran in a shallow, curving path directly towards the enemy's flanking machine gun nest. It was a suicidal route. It was completely exposed to the main NVA force to the front for a good 15 meters. But crucially, for the first part of its length, it was in a blind spot for the RPD itself. The gunner would have to leave his position and expose himself to fire into that gully. It was a tiny window, a crazy, insane, 1 in a million chance, but it was the only one they had. "Jenkins ammo!" Kowalski barked, his voice a low growl that cut through the panic. "The pig's down!" Jenkins yelled back, not understanding. "Not that one. The belts give me 2 belts, link 'em." Kowalski's command left no room for argument. He was already shrugging the sling of the heavy M60 over his shoulder. Jenkins, acting on pure instinct, fumbled with the heavy canvas ammo pouches, pulling out 200-round belts. His hands trembled as he linked the end of one belt to the beginning of the other, creating a single, long strand of 7.6 mm cartridges. Lieutenant Evans, crouched behind a tree nearby, saw Kowalski moving. "Kowalski, what the hell are you doing? Get down. That's an order." Kowalski ignored him. There was no time for debate. No time for permission. He grabbed the linked belts from Jenkins, draping the heavy chain of brass and lead over his left forearm. He chambered around, the metallic clunk a final, decisive sound. He looked at Jenkins, his face a mask of grim determination. When you hear my gun, you and everyone else, pour it on the front, everything you've got. Understood? Jenkins just nodded, his eyes wide. Kowalski took one last look at the killing zone, at his friends pinned down and dying. Then he turned and, with the M60 held at his hip, he broke from cover and lunged for the depression. The first 5 steps were a vortex of noise and terror. Rounds from the main NVA force snapped past his head, so close he felt the wind of their passage. Dirt kicked up around his boots. He kept his body low, a crouching run, his eyes locked on the elephant grass ahead. He was a single, isolated point, a man who had voluntarily left the relative safety of the herd to charge directly into the jaws of the predator. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear, but with a fierce, burning energy. He was no longer PFC Kowalski from Gary. He was a weapon, a single, focused instrument of retaliation. He reached the edge of the gully and plunged into the tall grass, the sharp blades whipping against his face and arms. For a few precious seconds, he was hidden from the RPD. The world narrowed to this tunnel of grass, the crushing weight of the pig, and the deafening roar of the battle he was now leaving behind. The elephant grass formed a tunnel around him, a narrow world of green stalks and stifling humidity. For 10 meters, the only fire he had to worry about was the harassing fire from the front, rounds zipping overhead or thudding into the earth bank to his right. He moved in a low, powerful crouch, the M60 a leaden weight in his arms, the linked ammunition belts clinking softly with each step. His breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning from the effort, and the adrenaline saturating his system. He could still hear the RPD clearly, its brutal, methodical burp, 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 a sound that was now his guiding star. He was homing in on it. He burst out of the end of the gully. The scene before him was suddenly terrifyingly clear. The RPD nest was just 25 meters away, dug in behind a massive, moss-covered fallen log. He could see the 2 NVA soldiers clearly now. The gunner, a man in a green pith helmet, was focused down his sights, his body rocking slightly with the recoil of his weapon as he continued to rake the American platoon. The loader, a younger soldier, was crouched beside him, a fresh drum magazine ready. They were disciplined, professional, and utterly oblivious to the threat that had just materialized on their exposed flank. Standard doctrine, the ghost of his training whispered, was to go prone, to find a stable firing position, to aim, to fire controlled bursts. But Kowalski knew that was a death sentence. The second he hit the dirt, he would lose his momentum. He would become a stationary target, and the main NVA force to his rear would pinpoint his location and obliterate him. His only advantage was his movement, his sheer, unexpected audacity. He kept walking. It wasn't a run. It was a deliberate, unstoppable advance, a hunter closing on his prey. He brought the M60 to his hip, his finger sliding inside the trigger guard. He took one more step, 2. His eyes locked on the gunner. At 15 meters, he depressed the trigger. The world dissolved into sound and violence. The M60 erupted with a deafening, full-throated roar, a sound so much heavier and more visceral than the chattering AKs or the higher-pitched RPD, firing from the hip. The weapon was a force of nature, bucking and vibrating in his hands like a living thing. Accuracy was a secondary concern. At this range, he was unleashing a storm of 7.62 milluk lead, a cone of destruction that was impossible to avoid. The first long burst walked across the fallen log. chewing splinters of wood and bark into the air. It caught the NVA loader in the side, slamming him against the log before he crumpled to the ground. The RPD gunner, startled by the sudden, overwhelming noise coming from his flank, turned his head. His eyes widened in shock and disbelief. He never had a chance to swing his weapon around. Kowalski adjusted his aim slightly, his arms muscles screaming as he fought the pig's recoil, and let loose a second. Sustained burst. The rounds hammered into the gunner's position, stitching a line of impacts across his chest and throwing him backward. The RPD fell instantly, blessedly silent. The sudden cessation of the machine gun fire was as jarring as its start. For a split second, the battlefield seemed to hold its breath, but Kowalski didn't. He was a man possessed, operating on a primal instinct to destroy the threat completely. He pivoted on his heel, his boots digging into the soft earth. The main NVA force, now aware of the tempest in their rear, began to redirect their fire towards him. He could see muzzle flashes winking at him from the jungle ahead. He didn't seek cover. He became the cover. He began moving parallel to their line, the M60 still at his hip. Firing short, savage 3 to 4 round bursts into the areas of muzzle flash and movement. He wasn't aiming for individual soldiers. He was hosing down entire sections of jungle, denying the enemy the ability to aim, to think, to function. He was a one-man walking barrage, a scythe of lead cutting through the green. Brass casings spewed from the ejection port, glittering in the dappled light as they fell to the jungle floor in a hot, metallic rain. The smell of burnt cordite and superheated metal filled his nostrils, a perfume of violence. He was no longer a soldier following orders. He was the embodiment of aggressive defense, a whirlwind of destruction that had turned the hunters into the hunted. The pivot was seamless, a fluid transition from destroying one threat to engaging the next. With the RPD nest silenced, the geometric equation of the ambush had been fundamentally altered. The anvil was gone. Now, it was just a disorganized hammer. And Kowalski was the unpredictable force smashing into its side. He moved with a purpose that defied all conventional wisdom. The M60, designed for prone or bipod-supported fire, was a monstrous handful. Firing it from the hip was an act of pure, brute strength and willpower. The recoil was a constant, jarring battle, the barrel wanting to climb and walk away from him with every burst. His shoulders and biceps burned with the effort, but the adrenaline coursing through him was a more potent fuel than any physical limitation. He advanced along the NVA's flank, his eyes scanning the jungle, reading the signs. A flicker of movement behind a thick cluster of bamboo, a muzzle flash from behind a termite mound. He didn't wait. He didn't aim in the traditional sense. He pointed the heavy weapon like a man pointing a finger of accusation and unleashed hell. Short, controlled bursts of 7.62 millimeter fire ripped through the bamboo, shredding it to pulp. The termite mound erupted in a cloud of dust and dirt. He was not shooting to kill specific men. He was shooting to kill their will to fight. He was creating a zone of such overwhelming, unpredictable violence that the enemy could not function. From the original American position, the sound of Kowalski's M60, now firing from deep within the enemy's own lines, was a galvanizing shock. Lieutenant Evans, still pinned but now with a sliver of hope, seized the moment. He's in their flank. Pour it on everyone. Suppressive fire on the front to us. A renewed, desperate volley of M16 fire erupted from the platoon. It was ragged, but it was volume. The NVA, now caught between the discipline, if desperate, fire from the front and the terrifying, close-quarters maelstrom created by the lone machine gunner in their midst. began to lose their cohesion. Their fire became less accurate, more sporadic. Kowalski saw two NVA soldiers break from cover about 20 meters to his left. They were trying to flank him now, to neutralize this unexpected threat. Their movements were sharp, professional. One provided covering fire, while the other bounded forward. Standard. Effective infantry tactics. Kowalski's response was neither standard nor defensive. He charged them. He broke into a low, powerful sprint, the M60 roaring as he fired on the move. It was the ultimate expression of his crazy tactic, constant, aggressive movement. He was denying them a stable target. Rounds from the covering soldier kicked up dirt at his feet. Kowalski ignored them, his focus entirely on the lead soldier who had just taken a knee to aim. He closed the distance from 20 meters to 10 in a handful of heartbeats and let loose a long, devastating burst. The soldier was thrown backward, his weapon flying from his hands. The second soldier, stunned by the sheer suicidal aggression of the charge, hesitated for a fatal second. He fumbled with his AK, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. That hesitation was all Kowalski needed. He didn't break stride. He swung the M60, the barrel smoking hot, and fired another burst from barely 5 meters away. The impact was brutal and final. He was now deep in the heart of the enemy position. A lone wolf in a pack that was suddenly confused and panicked. He dropped to a knee behind a thick tree, his chest heaving. The first long belt of ammunition was nearly expended. He could feel the heat radiating from the M60's barrel, a searing warmth even through his gloves. With movements honed by countless hours of drill, he executed a lightning-fast barrel change. He popped the latch, swung the hot barrel out, dropped it to the ground, and slammed a fresh, spare barrel into place. The whole process took less than 10 seconds. He then rammed the second, fresh 100-round belt into the feed tray, the charging handle slamming forward with a solid, metallic clunk. He was reloaded, rearmed, and ready to continue his one-man war. From his kneeling position, Kowalski's eyes, sharpened by adrenaline, scanned the chaos he had created. The NVA fire was becoming more disorganized, but it was still being directed. His gaze locked onto a subtle, yet critical, anomaly in the jungle about 30 meters to his right front. It was a small, low mound of earth, almost perfectly camouflaged with transplanted ferns and vines, but it was too symmetrical, and protruding from the top was a slender, whip-like radio antenna, swaying gently. Beside it, he could just make out the top of a green pith helmet and the frantic gestures of a man who was clearly shouting orders. This was it, the brain of the ambush, the command post. The assaulting it head-on would be suicide. It undoubtedly had a clear field of fire, but Kowalski had already thrown the rulebook into the jungle mulch. He saw another opportunity, a path of slightly less dense undergrowth that curved around to the bunker's rear. It was a risk. He'd be exposing his back to the remaining NVA, but it was the only way. He rose again, the freshly barreled M60 feeling marginally cooler in his grasp. He didn't fire. He ran. He broke into a full, low sprint, ignoring the sporadic rounds cracking past him. He moved like a phantom, using the natural cover, his focus entirely on getting behind that bunker. The NVA, confused and pressured from the front by the platoon's renewed fire, were slow to react to this new, unpredictable movement. He came around the back of the mound. The perspective was completely different. The bunker was little more than a foxhole reinforced with logs and earth, but it was deep, and it was completely exposed from this angle. Inside, an NVA officer, his uniform distinct, was hunched over a field radio, yelling into the handset. A radio man crouched beside him, and a third soldier acted as a runner, preparing to move. They were the coordination, the nerve center. They heard him at the last second. The officer turned, his face a mask of shock that mirrored the RPD gunners. He fumbled for the pistol at his belt. There was no time for orders, no time for threats. Kowalski, from a distance of 10 meters, shoulder-fired the M60. He didn't spray. He aimed a single, sustained, 5-second burst poured directly into the confined space of the bunker. The sound was deafening, the impacts brutal. The radio handset exploded in a shower of plastic. The three men were thrown against the earthen walls by the force of the impacts. The shooting from the main NVA position, which had already been faltering, ceased entirely. The nerve center had been obliterated. Silence. It was the most profound sound Kowalski had ever heard. It descended upon the jungle like a physical weight, broken only by the moans of the wounded, the crackle of a few burning leaves, and Kowalski's own ragged, gasping breaths. He stood there, chest heaving, the M60's barrel smoking, the air around him thick with the smell of spent powder, blood, and torn earth. He was alone, surrounded by the evidence of his violence. It took a full minute for the stunned platoon to realize the fight was over. Lieutenant Evans, his voice tentative, called out, "Kowalski status." "Clear!" Kowalski managed to grunt, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. Cautiously, the surviving members of the platoon rose and began to sweep the area. The scene they discovered was one of utter devastation centered around Kowalski's path. They found the destroyed RPD nest, the two gunners dead. They found the two soldiers he had killed in the flanking attempt. They found the command bunker, a charnel house of 3 more bodies, and scattered along the path of his advance were 3 other NVA soldiers, caught in his suppressive fire. 8 enemy soldiers. An entire squad, plus its leadership, neutralized by 1 man in a whirlwind 3-minute assault. The after-action report, when filed, was a masterpiece of military understatement, focusing on aggressive initiative and flanking maneuver. But among the men of Alpha Company, the story was told and retold in vivid, reverent detail. They spoke of the Kowalski charge, of the gunner who had used a crew-served weapon like a rifle, who had advanced when he should have retreated, who had attacked when he should have sought cover, his crazy tactics, the hip-firing, the constant movement. The relentless aggression became a part of the unit's legend. The Army, initially skeptical, eventually recognized the profound psychological impact of such overwhelming, unexpected violence. While never officially codifying charging while hip-firing a machine gun, the core lesson was absorbed. Audacity could shatter an enemy's will faster than firepower alone. PFC Marcus Kowalski was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, but his real legacy was not the medal. It was the unshakable belief etched into every soldier who heard the story. In the face of a perfect trap, sometimes the only way out was to become something crazier, more aggressive, and more terrifying than the trap itself.